The Tree of Light. How have I never covered this weapon before? Well, I'll tell you, okay? I'll tell you, because when it first came out was over a year ago, I think, and I wasn't really posting a video on, oh, wait, no, was it 2 years ago now? And I wasn't really covering every new weapon that came to the game. So the Tree of Light kind of just got swept under the rug, got put away back into the box and stuffed into the attic once the Christmas time passed, and we're pulling it back out to take a look because it's coming back to the game today. And my honest first impression is that this is a perfectly good sword. It's not really, the top tier sword. It's not going to be changing the game, but it's really not bad at all. In fact, it has a really competitive swing speed of about 0.44, and its DPS is really quite good because it's meant to be a slower swinging sword that can do, high damage per hit. But it's also able to have an attack speed perk and a second attack speed perk and a crit build and all the good stuff that you want all at once, which means you can have that high damage and a crit build and an attack speed that makes it useful. And there are a lot of different ways to perk this thing, and we'll talk about them in a second. But for the weapon itself, it natively comes with a 6 perk that stuns enemies in a crowd every single 8th hit. So every 8 hits with this weapon, you'll note that it'll actually stun every single enemy around it, which is kind of a useful perk. And I gave it a 5th perk that gives me damage to those stunned enemies, but I found that to be not that useful, and we'll talk about that later. But suffice it to say that this has that special ability and a heavy attack that is maybe not that impressive. It's meant to like swing twice and then affect a large crowd of enemies, but it does that effectively, but not really an impressive amount of damage. So I didn't find myself using it that much, but I try to get off a couple of those just to demonstrate for the video. Now, what I will say with that stunning effect is it's really helpful against smashers. I'm never one to really care about stunning or impact, and I've mentioned this a bunch in videos. The only time it's ever really useful is like endurance or late game stuff where you can't kill enemies, and in conventional missions, that's really just not the case. One of the few times you'll ever encounter such a situation is when you're kind of going 1v1 against a smasher, and that's where, like I mentioned, every 8th hit stunning that smasher in place can, if you line it up correctly, cancel out some of the things that it's trying to do, some of the attacks that it'll use, and it's actually really, really nice to use that to, stun the smasher and get some extra time to attack him without him knocking you back. So it's nice. It's nice to have, but I'm not 100% convinced that it's all that useful. So if you're going to perk it, let's talk about that for a second, because there are other options. So every 8th hit, causes a stun is actually one of 3 6 perks that you can change it to. First and foremost is hitting an enemy, grants crit rating, and the other one is hitting an enemy grants damage. For most weapons, crit rating tends to be better, but for swords, because they already have such a high crit chance, it turns out that hitting an enemy granting damage tends to be the preferred way. So if you really love the Tree of Light and you're really trying to spend, everything you can to make this weapon as amazing as possible, then yeah, you can use a core perk to make it so that it's doing more damage every time you hit an enemy, but it's not going to be a hugely significant change. I mean, 30% extra damage is nice once you get going, but a whole core perk on a weapon like this is a little dubious when there are other swords in the game. And that's why I'm saying if you're a Tree of Light fanboy, because if you're going to spend it on a sword, I actually use the Core perk to change the Spectral Blade because it swings much faster, and that stacking damage is a little bit more effective because the Spectral Blade is a higher damage sword. But you might have noticed that higher swing speed was because it had more attack speed perk. So if you're going to be perking this weapon, I do recommend focusing on that 6 perk, deciding how you're going to want to use it. Do you want to have an attack speed perk plus a crit build? Do you want to maybe run this double crit damage, run it with Totally Rockin' Out? Are you trying to do double attack speed with Paleo Luna? We'll talk about all that starting now. So once you have your 6 perk figured out, you really want to lean into your 5th perk. I do think the damage to stun stagger, it makes sense if you have the stunning 6 perk, but I think it would just be more useful all around to have damage to miss monsters and bosses. Damage to afflicted and slowed and snared is basically never going to happen. The only time that's ever going to be active is if you're using a loadout like this, where corrosive strikes is a thing. So she can apply snare and affliction, but that is not a hero powerful enough to be building your loadout around. I mean, she is powerful and she is useful, but 37% of your crits activating slowed and snared, and then you'll do more damage. No. I think damage to miss monsters and bosses is already going to be an instant perk that is most useful against the enemies that need it, because anything that's not a miss monster or a boss is pretty much dead in 3 or 4 swings anyway. And I'm only talking about, fat husks. Like normal zombies are dying to 1 and 2 hits anyway with a Paleo Luna build, so it doesn't really matter, and I think damage to miss monsters and bosses is the way to go. As for the element, nature, because we're in a nature zone, but it's a less interesting topic, which is why I'm talking about it now. let's get into the meat and potatoes. The attack speed versus crit rating, crit damage. So I think attack speed, crit rating, crit damage, as the build I've got going here is, I think that's the best all around. That is the base way to run this weapon. That is going to be the most normal for all builds. However, it's actually the most inferior depending on how you want to play. So if you're going to be running Paleoluna in the lead, which is the loadout that I'm using now, I'm actually going to focus on it for a second here. You actually want as many attack speed perks as possible because she is just broken. The amount of health bonus that you get, that bonus damage, it is so nice. And as many attack speed perks as possible is really nice. And I'm also going to recommend a crit damage perk because of anatomy lessons. And if you don't have Whiteout Fiona, you might want to skip this part, maybe make it a damage perk. But because she ups the crit rating of your swords, it's actually really useful. And you, believe it or not, don't actually need a crit rating perk anymore. So if you're going to run it with, the typical Whiteout Fiona and, Paleoluna, then double attack speed, crit damage is what you're going to want to do. And that is actually, as you can see, how I run one of my Ravagers. Just triple attack speed, crit damage, and the same thing with my Spectre Blade, triple attack speed, crit damage. That is the way you'd want to go. Now, if you don't use Whiteout Fiona and you're not going to have that up crit rating, then the Founder's Blazing Masamune is a great example of how you're going to want to perk it. Triple attack speed and damage. It's not that big of a deal. You don't want a crit rating perk. If you're not going to have crit damage, you don't want crit rating, but double attack speed damage is going to do plenty of damage, and it's going to be perfectly fine. This weapon is already doing way more damage per swing than the other swords, so you're not going to be missing out on a lot of damage there. Now, if you are going to be running Totally Rockin' Out, that is where you're going to want to have as many crit damage perks as possible. You can, believe it or not, as you can see, have 3 crit damage perks on this. Now, Totally Rockin' Out will up your swing speed and your crit rating, and if you want to bother with Whiteout Fiona and support, you will have plenty of crit rating and perhaps plenty of attack speed. So you can do triple crit damage. I don't think that's reliable enough personally, but that might be a very fun way to play and definitely something you want to try out. I'm going to leave that to you guys. That's why there's no gameplay of it, but I'm just saying it's possible. It might not be, the most reliable, seeing as you will need Totally Rockin' Out active. So you're going to need a lot of wafers or traps activating your ability or something, but regardless, it is possible, and I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention it. And then, of course, there's like the typical, classic AR build, where if you want to do crit rating, double crit damage, that's a thing, but I'm only bringing this up to mention a common thing that I always mention with melees, and that is, if you're going to be running a melee, almost regardless, unless it's something like the ear splitter or something where you're relying on the heavy attack, something specific like that. If it's a sword, for example, where your main damage output is the weapon that you're using, an attack speed perk is almost always recommended. In this case is no exception. It's already got a fairly slower swing speed, so an attack speed perk brings it up to like normal kind of ish, a little slower than normal. So you are definitely going to want at least one attack speed perk no matter what you do. And if you're using, like I mentioned, Totally Rockin' Out, that is where you're going to get your attack speed bonus. So whatever you do, I recommend an attack speed or 2 attack speed, depending on how you're going to perk it. For my own personal interests in that I'm going to be streaming today, and you can follow my Twitch, link in the description below. Maybe I'm live on the day that you're watching. I might try that triple crit damage build just because it sounds like a fun time. Now, I briefly mentioned the element earlier. I am running this nature for a reason, because as of right now, we're recording this in, the new year, first one of 2020, believe it or not, my first video on the channel of this year. All of the zones are water because we're in a winter storm, or winter, I don't know exactly what they're calling it, but an ice storm essentially. All of the zones are water. So if you're playing in the future where all of the zones are fire or all of the zones are nature, then you're probably going to want to change the element on this to match. And if they're just kind of normal and all the zones are sort of random, then energy would be the best all around. Or if you're in Stonewood or Plankerton, physical might be the best way to go. Somebody did actually leave a comment on one of my videos a while ago mentioning that Stonewood players can't actually level up weapons high enough for the element to matter, but I don't know. It still makes sense that all the Stonewood zombies aren't elemental, so if you're in a position to level it up high enough, I guess physical is still going to be better in those zones, but once you get to Candy Valley and beyond, elemental enemies are going to be more prevalent, and nature slash, energy slash whatever's going on will be the best way to go. But that just about sums it up for the Tree of Light. I'm a little surprised that I never covered this weapon. Like I mentioned, I mean, even though I missed it on day 1, it's still a good weapon. I have nothing bad to say about it. It's really up to snuff with some of the other best swords in the entire game, so I'm glad to have covered it today. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code Mista to check out. Follow my Twitch, link in the description below. My streams are awesome. You guys can become a channel member here with the join button on the channel or the link in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. And then